Hello, and welcome to part 3 of skull anatomy. In part 3, we'll discuss the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. Let's begin with sphenoid. Now, on this diagram, sphenoid is outlined in orange. And again, this is a superior view of the bone, so we'll be looking from the top down. As you can see from the diagram, the sphenoid is centrally located in the cranium, and it really serves as an anchor for all 8 cranial bones. The central portion of the sphenoid bone is the body. So the middle portion here is known as the body. The body isn't well seen on this diagram. It's kind of hard to depict, but you should know that the body of the sphenoid contains the sphenoid sinus, which we'll talk about in lab, and the sella turcica, which you can see here. The sella turcica actually derives its name from words meaning Turkish saddle, and you'll be able to see when we look at it from the side that it actually looks like a saddle. The sella turcica is important because it partially surrounds and protects a major gland in our body, the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland kind of sits inside that sella turcica. Behind or posterior to the sella turcica is the back of the saddle, and that's called the dorsum sellae. And you can see that here. The sella turcica and the dorsum sellae are best visualized in a lateral drawing or position, and we'll look at that here in a couple slides. The clivus. The clivus is a shallow depression that begins on the posterior and inferior aspect of the dorsum sellae, and it actually extends all the way to the foramen magnum at the base of the occipital bone. So again, if I can find my mouse, here is the clivus, and it kind of runs all the way to the foramen magnum. On either side of the body of the sphenoid bone are 2 sets of wings. The smaller pair of wings is called the lesser wings, and they are nearly horizontal. And when we look at the sphenoid bone from an anterior perspective, you can really see how the wings are horizontal. The lesser wings end in the anterior clinoid processes. And you can see that here is the anterior clinoid processes. The lesser wings extend laterally to about the middle of each orbit. The greater wings extend laterally from the sides of the body and form a portion of the floor of the cranium and the sides of the cranium. There are 3 pairs of small openings or foramina that exist within the greater wings, and those are really needed for passage of certain cranial nerves. And you can see the 3 foramina here. I'm not going to test you on the 3 foramina. Just know that they exist within the greater wing of the sphenoid, and they are for the passage of cranial nerves. Here is an oblique view of the sphenoid bone. So we've removed the sphenoid bone from the cranium, and we've kind of turned it so it's angled. And people sometimes liken this bone, the sphenoid bone, to a bat, kind of with its wings extended and its legs down. And you can see on this oblique view that this sphenoid bone has many grooves and canals, and optic nerves and arteries pass through those grooves and canals into the orbital cavity. Note, for example, the pterygoid processes. Those little bumps or processes form part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So there's really a lot happening in the sphenoid bone. I'm not going to test you on this oblique view. This is just to give you an idea of all the little nooks and crannies, and there's a lot of important stuff happening in these grooves and canals. Here is a lateral view of the sella turcica, and you can really see how it looks like a saddle. Remember, the sella turcica is within the body of the sphenoid bone. When we image the skull, we can use the sella turcica, among other structures, to help determine correct positioning. Any distortion of the sella turcica can be caused by improper positioning, such as tilt or rotation. But it can also be caused by a deformity of the sella turcica. And sometimes that deformity is the only clue radiographically that there's an intracranial lesion. So when we take a lateral skull x-ray, for example, we will look at the ridges above the orbits. We will look at the sella turcica. We'll look at the mandible. So there's several clues that tell us if we have any tilt or rotation. So sometimes we'll be perfectly positioned, no tilt, no rotation, everything looks good, but the sella turcica still looks distorted. That can be a clue that there's a lesion in the region of the pituitary gland, for example. CT and MRI are going to be better modalities to detect any type of lesion or deformity of the sella turcica. And again, we'll best visualize the sella turcica and the dorsum sellae in a lateral skull. So you can see here are the anterior clinoid processes. Remember, those are part of the lesser wing. The sella turcica is kind of the saddle-shaped tunnel where the pituitary gland lives. You have the dorsum sellae and then that clivus, which extends all the way to the foramen magnum. So let's take another look at the sphenoid bone from the front and from the side. The sphenoid bone here is orange in color. Okay, so you can see it here and then here. And remember that I mentioned earlier that the wings of the sphenoid bone are almost horizontal. And you can really see that on the frontal projection here, how they make up the back wall of your orbits. So that's the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. And we'll talk more about orbit anatomy in another lecture. You can also see the sella turcica and the dorsum sellae here on the lateral, right here. By the way, because of the sphenoid bone's central location in the skull, the sphenoid bone actually articulates with all 7 of the other cranial bones and 5 facial bones. Okay, good. So now let's talk about the ethmoid bone. So the last cranial bone we need to discuss is the ethmoid bone. And you can see it's shown in blue on these diagrams. So here is a lateral perspective. Here is a superior perspective, so looking from the top down. And here is a coronal perspective, so looking from the front, for example. The ethmoid bone lies primarily below the floor of the cranium, and only the top of the ethmoid bone is shown on a superior view, which we see here. Remember, it's situated in that ethmoidal notch of the frontal bone, and we talked about that in part 1. So you can see here, it's in the ethmoid bone sits in that notch in the frontal bone. A magnified coronal view of the entire ethmoid bone is shown here again on the right. Notice the cribriform plate. That aspect of the ethmoid bone contains many small openings or foramina through which branches of the olfactory nerves pass. And remember, the olfactory nerves are the nerves of smell. So you can see the cribriform plate here. Projecting superiorly from the cribriform plate is the crista galli. And the crista galli, that word is derived from the word rooster comb. And you can actually see the crista galli on x-ray near the frontal sinuses in the forehead. And I'll point that out for you in lab. Most of the ethmoid bone, again, lies beneath the floor of the cranium. And you can kind of imagine that here on this lateral perspective. Most of the bone is below the floor of the cranium. Projecting downward in the middle of the ethmoid bone is the perpendicular plate. That helps to form part of the bony nasal septum. The 2 lateral masses, or labyrinths, are suspended from the undersurface of the cribriform plate on each side of the perpendicular plate. So in other words, the lateral masses are on either side of the perpendicular plate, suspended from the bottom of this cribriform plate. The lateral masses contain the ethmoid air cells, or sinuses, and help to form the medial walls of the orbits and the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Within each lateral mass are projections of bone called the superior and middle nasal concha, or turbinates. And you can really visualize that better on an AP projection. The ethmoid bone articulates with two cranial bones, the frontal and the sphenoid. And the ethmoid bone also articulates with 11 facial bones. All right, so this concludes part 3 of skull anatomy. I want you to pause here and quiz yourself. See if you can identify all of the anatomy labeled on this diagram. The answers are in your textbook. We'll wrap up skull anatomy in part 4, discussing sutures, junction points, and fontanelles. So good luck.